Today's side event is taking place during the 54th session of the Commission for Social Development, whose priority theme is Rethinking and Strengthening Social Development in the Contemporary World. The title of the panel discussion is Financing Tools for Reducing Social Inequalities. It means that we're meeting here today to reflect on the financing achievements or shortfalls of UN development policy making in 2015. We'll be looking back at the third International Conference on Financing for Development and the recent Paris Climate Meeting and attempt to address this central question. How can the Addis Ababa Action Agenda serve as an instrument to reduce inequalities and encourage a people-centered approach to strengthening social development and care for the future of our planet? So it's quite a bold agenda, but we have with us today quite a diverse and high-level panel of policy experts. So I'll just read out our speakers for today. We have His Excellency Ambassador George Walker Talbot of the Republic of Guyana. We also have Mr. Narayan Subramanian, who's a climate policy officer and independent diplomat for the Republic of the Marshall Islands. We have Ms. Shari Spiegel, who's the Chief of the Policy Analysis and Development Branch of the FFD Office at UN DESA. And we have Mr. Herman, a part-time visiting faculty member with the Julian Studley Graduate Program in International Affairs within the Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Policy at the New School in New York. So thank you all for coming today and for making this conversation possible. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll begin with the speakers' interventions. There'll be about 10 minutes each. After that, we'll then break out for a Q&A and try and have more of an informal discussion, because I'd really like to get everyone's input on the topic and to try and get a discussion going so that it's not just us speaking at you. And we hopefully will have a little bit more time because we started a bit late due to the previous presentation. So we'll just have to stand our ground a little bit when they open the doors. We'll do a few rounds of questions at the end. And if, by all means, if you don't have time to ask the question you want to ask, feel free to approach the panelists afterwards because they might push us towards the exit. But that's how it goes, I'm afraid. Okay, so our first speaker today is Ambassador Talbot. Ambassador has extensive experience in multilateral affairs. He's held several posts on intergovernmental bodies within the UN system. This includes acting as chair of the Economic and Financial Committee of the General Assembly, but importantly and most recently, co-facilitator of the preparations for the negotiations for the third International Conference on Financing for Development this past July. He'll speak to us about the recent outcomes of this conference and how he views this may impact social development policy objectives. So, Ambassador, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Thank you for the invitation to be among a distinguished panel. I'm honored to be here and happy to share a few perspectives on the FFD process. I speak not as an expert, even though, so I admit the misnomer that you use and respected me. The experts are around me. But I was privileged to be a facilitator of the FFD process, which allowed for us to harness the expertise of delegations as well as other actors, civil society, the private sector, etc., in coming to a consensus known as the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. That was, of course, a very fraught process, very challenging process, but thankfully we arrived at a conclusion. And I would say that the Addis outcome is, there are three aspects of the Addis outcome, or three characteristics. One is that I think it's conceptually holistic. It is intended to be a framework for financing development post-2015, essentially financing sustainable development. And in that foster that in the context of financing. Secondly, I think it's substantively comprehensive. It is, to date, the most comprehensive outcome on financing for development. Its scope expanded significantly on account of the post-2015 development agenda, to which it is very much related. And that brings me to the third characteristic, is that it is organically linked to the SDGs and the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And if you were to carefully review the Addis outcome, you will see that many of the means of implementation, goals, and targets in the 2030 agenda are also reflected. And in addition to reflecting those, it provides some measure of context and orientation in how we might move forward in addressing those goals and targets. So those three aspects by way of introduction. Addis, of course, affirms a strong political commitment to address the challenge of financing for development and creating an enabling environment for that purpose. It does so in a spirit of global partnership and solidarity. So in speaking to the financing and the enabling environment, it addresses not only the question of resources, but the question of policies, of institutions. We know that we can't simply throw money at problems. We have to find the policies and institutional and other mechanisms that will engender the totality of response that is necessary for addressing whatever the issue is. The Addis outcome establishes overarching goals, it promotes key deliverables, and it pursues specific actions across 7 action areas. We all are familiar with these action areas in terms of domestic public resources, domestic and international business and finance, international development cooperation, international trade, debt, systemic issues, and new in the context of the FFP agenda is the heightened attention to questions of science, technology, innovation, and capacity building. Addis also has set up a more robust, at least on paper, more robust follow-up mechanism than its predecessors. I think this is one of the key distinctions of the Addis process, which allows for a more concerted effort on trying to unlock the implementation of this outcome. Of course, the implementation of Addis is not to be pursued in isolation. It has to be seen in conjunction with the 2030 agenda. Otherwise, we will not achieve the synergies, we will not achieve the impact that we wish, because one of the key fulcrums, if I might say, of the Addis approach is really to try to harness the synergies that are seen to exist across the goal set. We have 17 goals. Many of them, of course, are very much interrelated, one to the other. And as a result of that, the Addis outcome has, in addition to addressing the multiple goals and targets substantively, it also identifies a range of what we've called deliverables. There are 7 broad deliverables that I would call them highlight deliverables. That is not the exhaustive list, but at the beginning of the Addis outcome, we speak to 7 areas which I will I will highlight, and you will note, of course, that the social dimension looms very large in the Addis framework. It looms large in terms of the goals of Addis, which has been posited as ending poverty and achieving sustainable development in its three dimensions, including by promoting inclusive economic growth. So there again, that is linking to the social dimension. Protecting the environment and specifically promoting social inclusion. So the social fabric is woven through the outcome in a very significant way. And in terms of the 7 deliverables, we note that among them is the first of these deliverables is the proposal to deliver social protection and essential services for all. This is a critical deliverable which we thought we needed to establish at least a minimum that is of a standard that lifts all people across the globe. The second deliverable is the proposal to scale up efforts to end hunger and malnutrition. So I think just by citing 2, the third is the idea of the bridging the infrastructure gap. Fourthly, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization. Fifth, generating full and productive employment and decent work for all, and promoting micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And they tell me that the overwhelming bulk of the generators of employment are to be found in the small and medium-sized and the micro sector of economies. 6, promoting ecosystems, and 7, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies. So with these 7 highlight deliverables, if I might put it that way, because there are many other deliverables in the body of the outcome. The attempt here was to sort of find broad entry points connecting Addis with the 2050 development agenda. Addressing these elements and mobilizing around these elements allows us to capture a more holistic approach to the goals. Not, of course, to deny, in addressing the question of integration, which is one of the key demands of the Sustainable Development Agenda coming out of Rio. We also have to be mindful of the need for the specialized attention to specific issues. We can't address goals merely tangentially. We have to address goals frontally. But we want to do so in a way that speaks to the interlinkages of these goals and targets and seeks to use resources more optimally and also to ensure that the impact is through such an approach is such that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So that is the sort of philosophy that has underpinned our approach to the Addis outcome. So not only do we have the social dimensions woven through the fabric of the outcome, but we also, of course, we speak directly to it in a number of instances, and I've cited just a few examples, but in the overall outworking of implementation of Addis, the social agenda will definitely be a key element for impact and results. So, by way of introduction, I would say that Addis speaks in a very, I think, holistic way to the development equation, and it also speaks specifically to the question of the social dimension. One of the, I would say, hallmark elements of the Addis outcome is the strength of emphasis on the question of gender equality, the focused attention to the questions relating to children, which are, of course, have been woven into a financing framework in terms that have not been witnessed in previous outcomes. Sometimes we make a division between the so-called hardcore, the financing, and the trade, and the systemic questions, and soft. But what Addis, I think, has done, which I think is in keeping with that thrust towards an integrated approach, is to weave those issues in. Of course, allowing for critiques in different directions, but the world, of course, is not a world that it's a world where issues intersect. And I think one of the challenges for us, for those who are policymakers, is to really find the points of intersection and how to address those points of intersection, how to design the policy interventions that will capture those intersections and move several domains forward on the same, using the same shot or bullet, if I might put it that way. It's a very complex, of course, exercise, but certainly not beyond human engineering. Thank you very much.
Well, on behalf of the NGO Committee on Social Development, I add my welcome to that of Mark, and it is my privilege to introduce Mr. Narayan Subramanian. How do I do on that? Okay. He's a climate policy officer for Independent Diplomat, a member of the climate change team, which advised the Republic of the Marshall Islands on UN climate change negotiations since 2009. More recently, he was at the Paris Climate Change Conference in December to support their foreign minister, H.E. Tony de Bruyn, in his efforts to build and lead the High Ambition Coalition, an economically and geographically diverse grouping of progressive countries committed to an ambitious global climate change agreement. Narayan will give us some brief words on the climate finance outcomes of the summit and the benefit for small island developing states. Narayan.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here today. I just want to start off by giving some quick context as to what Independent Diplomat, my organization, is. We are a nonprofit diplomatic advisory group that's been around since 2004. Our mission basically is to advise and assist marginalized groups and countries, and among those, small island developing states. I'm on the climate change team and have been working with the Marshall Islands in the lead up to the Paris Climate Change Conference. So if you just go to the next slide. So back in December, it was a major moment when 194 countries came together and adopted a global climate change agreement. And what this agreement is supposed to do is basically lay the framework for international climate action for the next few decades. And one of the most remarkable achievements in the lead up to Paris is the fact that up to 180 countries had pledged climate action ranging from developed, developing, to vulnerable countries. So this is truly a global effort. If we can go to the next slide, I just wanted to lay out some of the major highlights of the Paris Agreement before I delve into the finance specifics. And I should say, I should preface this with these major elements. In some way or another, the Marshall Islands either conceived of or championed and helped pull these across the finish line through developing and leading what we call the High Ambition Coalition. Many of you would have heard about this, and it was heralded as the biggest diplomatic force at the COP. So it was quite a remarkable achievement on the part of the Marshall Islands. So of the major design elements, the first one that I wanted to highlight is the long-term temperature goal. So for a long time, we've heard about the 2 degrees Celsius temperature goal and the need to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees. One of the major breakthroughs in Paris was finally a recognition that we need to also pursue efforts to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, which the science says is necessary for some of the world's most vulnerable countries or low-lying island nations, like the Marshall Islands, to survive past this century. Being just about an average of 2 meters above sea level, you can imagine how important securing 1.5 degrees in the agreement was for the Marshall Islands and other small island developing states. The second major element of the agreement is what we call the long-term mitigation goal. And this is probably I don't know if you guys can read it, but I'll just quickly summarize it. It's probably one of the most important paragraphs in the entire agreement. And the reason I say that is what it does is it translates, or we say operationalizes that temperature goal. It basically lays out exactly what we globally need to do over the course of the century to meet that temperature goal. And so it says we need to peak global emissions as early as possible, and then rapidly reduce our emissions thereafter to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the second half of the century. So what that does is it lays out a direction of travel. It's a very, very clear signal to both governments and private actors and investment and those involved in investing as to where we're headed. So this is so we can all reorient ourselves towards what we call the low carbon or eventually zero carbon economy. The last element that I want to highlight is the 5-year mitigation cycles. I'm a little simplistic here because there's a couple of different things associated with it. But basically what countries agreed in Paris is that if we consider 2015 to be a major political moment for climate action, where everyone from national governments to state and subnational governments to even the Pope and private investment actors all came together and took different climate pledges and commitments, well, we want to replicate that every 5 years. And so countries agreed that every 5 years they'd come together and have another major political moment where they would put forward new commitments. And in the lead up to each one of those political moments, well, one of the other things that countries agreed to do is take a global stock take. And that stock take would not just be on mitigation action, what we're doing to reduce our emissions, but also what we're globally doing in terms of adaptation. And finally, and most relevant to our conversation today, where we're at in terms of financing, what the deficit is between where we need to be for finance and where we are, and how we can plug that gap. And that's especially important when you're talking about developing countries, in which many submitted what we call conditional nationally determined contributions, saying we will unconditionally do X, and we will conditionally do Y based on how much financing there is for us to undertake these emissions reductions. So these are the major elements. And if you go to the next slide, for specifically the small island developing states and least developed countries, I wanted to highlight the loss and damage aspect of the negotiations. And this is actually quite a breakthrough in Paris. And the reason is because for the longest time, loss and damage as a concept has kind of been grouped with adaptation, climate adaptation. And what happened in Paris was this conceptual distinction that was created, by creating a standalone article in the agreement on loss and damage, basically saying if there's a continuum on mitigation actions, so you take actions to reduce your emissions, and then there's adaptation, what you do about the inevitable consequences of climate change that you adapt to. And then finally, loss and damage has now emerged as a separate issue that concerns what we do about the effects of climate change that we cannot adapt to. And so of the many things that were agreed on loss and damage, loss and damage was refocused from not just looking at extreme weather events that create permanent loss or damage, but also looking at some of the slow onset events that happen over time, such as sea level rise or ocean acidification and subsequent coral bleaching. And if you can imagine for an island nation, that has huge economic effects, that has territorial effects and many, many other things. And so the Paris Agreement also anchors something called the Warsaw International Mechanism, which was agreed back in 2013 in Warsaw. And that is basically the loss and damage arm of the UNFCCC now. And by anchoring it and tying it to the Paris Agreement, basically that mechanism now is supposed to respond to that stock take that I was talking about, and basically where we're at globally at any given moment. And so the Warsaw International Mechanism is also supposed to tell us, among the many things it's supposed to do, such as mobilize capacity building and finance, it's also supposed to help establish things such as risk insurance mechanisms, building off of the success of things such as the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which was established in 2007. It was a regional risk insurance mechanism to help Caribbean states with extreme weather events. And so now they're trying to basically compile best practices and replicate these across the world. So in terms of financing, this was a huge step forward. If we go to the next slide. I just wanted to highlight some of the major aspects in the finance section of the agreement. For one, the agreement reiterates the importance of the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility and the other major financial arms and mechanisms that currently exist under the UNFCCC, such as the Least Developed Countries Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, et cetera, et cetera. What it also does is it reaffirms the need to reach the $100 billion per year goal that was set by countries back in 2009 in Copenhagen, where they said that through both private and public financing, they would reach $100 billion that would mainly come from developed countries. And finally, it said that starting in 2025, the $100 billion would be the floor, and from there they would determine what the new goal is going to be. Now, if we go to the next slide, there's a couple of issues that emerge from this. And so I've just tried to, this is not an exhaustive list of the sources of climate finance coming out of the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC at large. But one of the major issues that's currently going on is, so the Green Climate Fund, when they agreed to establish the Green Climate Fund in 2009, there were a lot of things that were left unclear and that really came to the fore last year when they were starting to look at where they were in relation to that $100 billion goal. The goal was to reach $100 billion a year by 2020, and as of October of 2015, we're sitting at about $10 billion in the Green Climate Fund. Many had assumed that the Green Climate Fund would be the primary vehicle to deliver the $100 billion, and all of a sudden it seemed woefully inadequate. So then the OECD came together and put together a study to see where we're at on climate finance. The OECD came back and said, well, we're actually at $60 billion in terms of climate finance. And obviously that garnered a lot of dissatisfaction from developing and vulnerable countries, because they saw this more as a methodological or accounting exercise rather than an earnest attempt to actually create additional financial flows for climate finance. And so that's kind of where we're at going into Paris, and that still remains and a somewhat unresolved issue is how do we actually determine additionality with regard to the Green Climate Fund, with regard to the $100 billion finance pledge. So looking at climate finance at large, coming out of the Paris Agreement, right now we have the Green Climate Fund, which is poised to dole out about $2 billion this year. And another thing I should mention with regard to the Green Climate Fund is the Green Climate Fund has agreed that it would split the money it gives between adaptation and mitigation. And this was a hard-fought battle for developing and vulnerable countries, because the biggest fear with regard to climate finance is that the vested interest is to put money towards emissions reductions and not so much towards adaptation action, especially in developing and vulnerable countries such as the Marshall Islands. So where we're at right now is a lot of the multilateral development banks are starting to reorient what they're doing post the Paris Agreement. Now we have a bunch of pledges on the table. We know how much money a lot of these developing countries have to put towards climate finance. So the deficit is pretty clear. And so multilateral development banks are starting to work together to try to figure out how we can actually deliver on finance to help enhance climate action across the world. Another thing I'd like to highlight is that one of the big things that's changing right now is we're not just looking at multilateral development banks and the Green Climate Fund, but we're also looking at bilateral assistance. And China just established a South-South Cooperation Fund. So they're somewhat going it alone. They've put $3 billion on the table, but that's going to be delivered bilaterally. And so we have all these different financial flows coming from different sources. And the next question is how do we actually make sure that gets delivered to the place it needs to get delivered? And that's the question that remains to be answered in this year and the years to come as we begin to start implementing the Paris Agreement. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So at this stage, we've heard from sort of two very different tracks. We've heard from the financing for development track and how that ties into the new development agenda, dealing with sustainable development, but also the parallel track dealing with climate issues and the recent developments that's taken place in Paris, particularly dealing with climate finance itself, the shortfalls that we've had and the new directions it's taking. Now I'd like to turn to our policy expert on financing for development, Shari Spiegel. I would say, I know you had some comments as well on the outcomes of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, but I was also wondering, because a lot of us know that there's going to be an April review session coming up, and we're just, I think, curious also to know what's going to be said there in the sense of how successful the meeting was, but also what implementation methods are going to be approached in order to follow through on the commitments that were made in Addis, and sort of what's on the table now going forward.
And I'll maybe end with that. Thank you all for having me here, and thanks to the earlier speakers. In terms of saying that these are very separate processes, in a sense, they're not really so separate. So certainly Paris was a lot bigger, but they're all, I think, building on each other. And when we were negotiating, or when they were negotiating Addis, there was a lot of discussion about what was happening in Paris and how to relate these. And then I think that the September agreement, as well as the Paris agreement, really built on and incorporates a lot of the things that were already discussed in Addis. So I think all of these processes were building on each other. Ambassador Talbot gave an overview of Addis, and I just want to stress that a lot of the social issues and inequality issues and climate issues are in Addis in places that really haven't been discussed very much yet. So, for example, the private sector chapter hasn't been discussed very much. But in the private sector, there are several issues that are sort of lines and words that are there that no one's really paid attention to, including something about bonuses of investors, about trying to including a lot about the incentives of investors and aligning incentives with global goals, particularly the issue of long-term and short-term investment, and which has a big impact on climate, for example, because one of the reasons that investors don't take climate into consideration is because climate risks tend to be longer term, and investors are very, very short term, sometimes, as we all know, just minutes or days, but certainly not 15, 20, 30 years where some of this is really important for particular businesses. So Addis actually talks about, has statements in there about agreements to align regulatory systems and other incentives in line with both long-term investing as well as with sustainability indicators. So it's not clear what actions that means, but this is really the first time that governments have together agreed on some of these very specific issues as goals for the financial sector that no one has really talked about much, but have big implications both for climate as well as for inequality issues. And then the place where Addis most talks about some of the social issues is the social contract. And I just wanted to say what I was going to show in the slides, I don't know if it's worth going to it. That's just a paragraph on delivering social protection. And the parts in green are not more important than the others, but they sort of trying to break down what the issues are in that paragraph. And the point is that there are two separate issues that are going on there. One is social protection systems and floors, and the other is minimum spending on social services. And they're two separate things in a sense. So there's overlap, but social, if you go to the next slide, you can just see this. Social, that breaks down what these two things are. The top social protection is, basically income support, pensions, cash transfers, other types of unemployment benefits, health insurance for the unemployed, disability, etc. Whereas the other piece of this, which are social spending requirements, is a separate thing. It's basically spending on a package of basic social services. Both are in there both of those together make up the basic social compact. As those of you who know, who sort of followed the negotiations, the initial language put forward by our co-facilitators was stronger than the final negotiated agreement, and agreed to where all countries, the initial language was that countries actually commit to basic social spending packages. In the new language, the final language, if you go back for a second to the previous one, really talks about encouraging countries to consider setting nationally appropriate spending targets. But nonetheless, despite that, I think that the very fact that there were many times during the negotiations when there was a risk this would go away completely, because countries don't want to agree internationally to commitments that they see as domestic issues that have to go through their budgets, through their parliaments for approval, to come to an international agreement on that. So that the very fact that that's there at all, and that there are these two separate issues that are there. And the third piece of this, again, go back to the first one. The other piece of this, the last piece in green, is that internationally there was an agreement to support countries that put this forward in this effort. Now, again, in a world where we see decreasing ODA, it's a question of what that really means. Where is the money being diverted from, et cetera? Because if you have a small pot, if you agree to put money there, it's coming from someplace else. But nonetheless, I think that the fact that you had all countries in the world agreeing together to leave this language in, and the importance of this, and then leaves it on the table for further discussion, and which is where we get to the next question of what comes next. And so the question on how we follow up on all of this. So the last two paragraphs in Addis were the follow-up section. And this is, as George said, it's a step forward in two ways. So the first way is that there's this new Financing for Development Forum that will happen, this year it's happening in April. There are questions of, most probably this year, 90% I would say this year happening in April. And then there are questions though in the future when it will be. But right now it's going to be immediately following the World Bank and IMF spring meetings in New York. And it's up to 5 days. There's a negotiation on how many days that will actually be, especially for the first year. And then the second thing that was set up was that the Secretary General set up an interagency task force to follow up on Addis, to do a substantive report to follow up on Addis. That will be the main input for the forum. And so what we've done so far in the Secretariat is we've gone through Addis, the entire agenda, and pulled out every either agreement or action item. So something like encouraging countries to consider is not necessarily a commitment, but it is an action item, which is setting up the action item. It would be setting nationally appropriate spending targets. And so each one of these items is on the table for further discussion. And we've clumped all of those items into what we call clusters. And the first year, we're not actually going to follow up on those. The first year, what we're doing is working with 50 UN agencies, and including some non-UN agencies. We're working on mostly other agencies that work on these issues, like the FSB, looking at some of the financial issues, the OECD, especially for aid issues. And we're going through the entire UN system, working with UNFCCC, for example, to say, what data do we have? How do we, and what information do we have? How can we monitor each of these different areas? And so in each area, there's a question of how to monitor. Now, monitoring is much more complicated than, this is not replicating the indicator process. So the indicator process, which I think most of you probably know about, the Statistical Commission and the Statistical Division are coming up with indicators for all of the SDGs, and including the SDG means of implementation. The means of implementation, all of them are in Addis. And if you looked at our outline, which is actually on our website, which is the outline of these commitments organized around the in the Addis Ababa Agenda, we list wherever there happens to be an MOI or an SDG where there will be an official indicator. But I think everybody who's working on that process and anybody who's worked with data knows that these issues are much too complicated to have one indicator as a real answer of what's really happening in that area, to really understand it. So Addis gives an opportunity to really go into a lot of these issues in much more detail and much more, both more deeply. A lot of the issues there are qualitative. How do you follow up with qualitative issues with a number? So some of them are qualitative, some of them are quantitative, and then some of them, one indicator is not sufficient. You really need to look at a range of indicators. And then in addition to that, there are also many issues in Addis that are not covered in the SDG indicators, in the SDGs, so those need to be covered as well. And so in each of these cases, we're looking at the first year, all we're doing is saying, how are we going to follow up? Where is there data? Where is there no data? When there's no data, what do you do? Can we look at case studies? Can we look at, should we be doing some surveys? How do we try to better understand what's happening in these areas? So the first year is really a technical exercise that will feed into the first Financing for Development Forum in April. And then in following years, we will be doing a much more in-depth discussion of the actual follow-up. There are a lot of questions that remain and that are really dependent on the political process, including is there a focus every year? Is there a theme? So in those issues, we actually need more lead from governments as to how the forum will be structured to follow that with the report. But between the web and the report, we are planning to continue to follow up on the entire agenda annually, and then some issues obviously there's no reason to follow up on them annually. It's almost self-defeating because nothing happens annually. So that's one of the issues we're looking at as well, is which ones really need to be followed up on annually, which ones can have a longer term cycle, or not long term, but slightly longer than a year. So that's where things are. The future years, we also plan, hopefully this year, we were given the mandate in January. The report has to be done by mid-March. In future years, we are hoping to have a full year cycle. And in those cases, we will have an open discussion period where we will post it and look to civil society for comments and inputs before the final thing is done. So that will, but we will, once we get into a full year cycle and we're really doing follow-up as opposed to just to looking at the technical pieces, it'll be open to get inputs from all of you, as well as the business sector, as well as anyone who's interested. So that's more or less where things are. And if there are any questions, we can also, so I'm happy to answer them. Between us, all of us here, we should be able to answer them. Maybe. Thank you very much.
And now we turn to scholarship and academia. Barry Herman, a familiar face to all of us, is a part-time visiting faculty member with the Julian Studley Graduate Program in International Affairs within the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. They must get paid by the word.
You give money.
At the New School, New York. After 30 years of service, Barry retired from the United Nations Secretariat in December 2005, where he had led a team undertaking research and supporting negotiations on international economic and financial issues. He publishes frequently on international policy issues, including sovereign debt crises, global economic governance, and other international financial issues. Barry will today present to us a brief summary of his recent paper on finance for social protection floors, which he recently published in the newsletter of the International Council on Social Welfare. Barry.
Okay, thank you. I don't know that I'll summarize that because it's online and you can read it, but I will make reference to it. And I want to bring the discussion to social finance, or financing social services, because we've kind of been all over the place, and in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, there's actually that very important but only one paragraph that addresses the issue. Now, I've worked on, I don't usually work on social finance issues, but I am sort of embarking on a project with some colleagues and friends, some of whom you know. We are from, I guess you could say, the North and the South. We are male and female. The only thing we have in common is that we're all old. So it's me and Gemma Adaba, who used to be at the International Trade Unions Confederation, John Langmore, who was a director of the social division here, as well as an Australian MP and represented ILO in New York and so on. And Eva Hamstengel, who's now at Bread for the World, and founded a little NGO under whose umbrella we are going to develop this project, called Social Justice and Global Development. And our intention is to generate discussion on how to go beyond the nice words and actually do things, you know. One distinction I would draw between the Addis Agenda and, in particular, the Monterey Consensus, which started this whole financing for development ball rolling, is that when there were general words in Monterey, for example, on aid, on official development assistance, there were two paragraphs. One made reference to the 0.7 target for achieving aid, contributions from developed countries, and the other was a sentence that said something like, we recognize that there's a need for substantial increase in ODA. Okay, those are, you know, almost innocuous words, but underlying them was an agreement among the donors that indeed they were going to increase ODA. Similarly, there was a statement to the effect that member states or governments would continue their efforts at reform of the voice, or of strengthening the voice and participation of developing countries in decision-making at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Underlying that was an agreement to try to do something to that effect. So it wasn't just, you know, words. I'm afraid that this time there are some underlying projects and intentions to work on things, but on many things there's nothing but words. And I would also say that social finance is the least developed of the ideas. For example, in the Addis Agenda, the word infrastructure appears 34 times. So I guess infrastructure is pretty important. And there's an agreement to have a new forum on infrastructure finance that will be led by the World Bank and...
No, it doesn't say the World Bank.
No, okay, sorry. But in fact will be led by the World Bank.
I don't...
Okay, well, it's not an important point. Which one, whoever leads it is not the issue. My point is that there's more attention. There's some attention, quite a bit of attention on infrastructure finance. Now, I don't want to downplay infrastructure finance. I think it's quite important. I want to rather raise the question, I'm not being critical. I'm just saying we need to work on how to finance social protection, and in particular, social protection floors. So we've embarked on this idea. We are at the stage of trying to propose a budget and go raise money at the foundations in this room that might be interested. I'll see you later. No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Don't feel any obligation. Because we think there needs to be some more discussion on this. And one of the things Gemma Adaba brought to my attention is, and I suppose it's an ILO figure, but something like 76% of the world population does not have, lives in a situation with an inadequate social protection floor. Wow, that's a lot of people. So, this ought to be something we should work on. And I used to have a staff member named Kawamura, who used to always ask the question, why this, why now? And so this is the Kawamura question, why this, why now? Okay, why this? It's important. And I would say inadequately addressed. Why now? I think it's shortchanged in the 2030 agenda. There are some references to social protection. In particular, let's see, the importance of governments providing social protection is in paragraphs 7 and 24, the introduction. That's the only place where things like human rights are mentioned, not in the goals themselves. But it's in goal 1.3 on poverty, 5.4 on gender equality, and 10.4 on inequality. Fine. Those are goals and targets, but it doesn't tell you how you're going to get there. There is, virtually nothing on that in the means of implementation. I'm not arguing that that was the place to do it. The place to do it could have been in the Addis Agenda, but as Shari intimated, there was not a lot of agreement, and it was something on which they decided to punt, basically. And why me? Well, actually, I sort of got interested in this because I was talking one day with Sergei Zelenev, who, I guess the director of the International Council on Social Welfare, and we were talking, because I had been asked by some other people what I thought of a proposal by two special rapporteurs on human rights. One, Olivia De Schutter on food, right to food, and I forgot her first name, Sepulveda on extreme poverty. Magdalena, thank you. And they put out a joint paper in 2012 that's on the webpage of the Human Rights, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, and proposed a fund for social protection, floors, meaning not all of social protection, but social protection at the basic level, to prevent real personal catastrophes. So it's kind of minimal social protection. The fund proposal went nowhere. Some NGOs got interested. Of course, ILO, not of course, but ILO was also interested. There is now a joint project between ILO and the World Bank to somehow work on social protection. I'm not sure where that's going. I don't think it's clear yet, but in any case, it's a discussion among two bureaucracies at this point, with lots of expertise. Some of my best friends are bureaucrats. I should apply not. But I think there's still room for a lot more work. And in any case, the fund idea is dead. But underlying the fund idea were a number of programs. And the idea of the fund was it would collect all the programs in one fund. So if there's not going to be a fund, there still can be some attention paid to these programs. And I would, and that's what I wrote about in that paper for the International Council on Social Welfare. And well, you can look at the paper. It's on their website, which is www.icsw.org. But I just would emphasize one thing. As an economist, I'm an economist, and I even sometimes teach a course on public finance. And within the discussions of how to deal internationally, how to deal with social protection floor financing, there are two issues. One is, ongoing expenditures, which public finance tells you should come from current revenues, domestic revenues, and then there's international support in emergency situations. And so we had one reference already to the catastrophe bonds that are issued under this program that the World Bank does. There is discussion, and the two human rights rapporteurs reflected it, on reinsurance of social insurance programs, so that if there's a sudden need, if there's a flood and a need for additional social expenditures, and it's beyond what the local financing can provide, then you could tap the reinsurance fund for resources. Okay, I want to say, let's not be overly complicated. I mean, I know you have to be more complicated to be politically more feasible. And these proposals that I've just mentioned are very much market-oriented, and there's a certain, there's interest. The reinsurance is all private. I mean, it's reinsurance companies that are doing it. Swiss Re and others. And the catastrophe bonds are sold to private investors. They're essentially taking a bet that there won't be a hurricane because they don't get repaid if there's a hurricane. And they get higher interest rates as a result. But I would say, no, wait a second. There's a public function here. And in this paper, I'd say, yeah, you know what? There is a fund that could be brought back to life at the International Monetary Fund. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was something, there still exists, but it's different. There was something called the Compensatory Financing Facility. So any year that a country experienced a shortfall in export earnings, either a collapse in commodity prices like we're seeing now, or some loss of export earnings because of some natural disaster, or some surge in grain import costs. Okay, you could go to the IMF, and in 2 weeks you can get your money. It was a loan. They would figure out the shortfall. They'd decide what percent of it they were going to cover, and you got your money. And it was fairly automatic. And I would say that one of the kinds of innovations one might look for are on things like that, which we already have an experience in using, and which were generally considered successful, although in 1980 with Reagan and Thatcher, they kind of fell by the wayside. So in any case, my basic message is I think we need to do some work on developing proposals and then developing interest in proposals. And so our project is to try to foment discussion among academics, among NGOs, among governments, among international institutions, among businesses on that. Because I think it's an issue that hasn't been adequately addressed. Thank you. Just to go back on Shari's presentation. Thank you for that. That was very, very helpful. Particularly to give us sort of an overview of where things are going with the review cycles, particularly the fact that there's going to be more of an opportunity for civil society and for all stakeholders to have that input on the review. I believe that all the information you were talking about is also available on your website, the UN DESA website. So if you wanted to look into that as well, and Barry's report, particularly with regards to social protection floors and
the opportunity to finance them, and the projects, the potential schemes that have been proposed, potential solutions to deal with that is also available. And I believe you said icsw.org. That's the where
It was their November newsletter. That was an article.
so that'll be there, and we'll disseminate a copy on our website, and we'll be sharing that as well. Right, at this stage, I know that we're a bit pushed for time, but as I said, we're going to stand our ground because we started a bit late. So we'll take a first round of questions. So anyone who wants to give a question, make a question, ask one of our panelists, please put your hand up, give us your name and potentially your organization as well, and please make it a question rather than an observation, because we're a bit pushed for time.
Hello, my name is Herman, and I'm part of an NGO for social justice. Then again, my question is, are there any precedents for collecting money from advanced countries for any damage that they have done before, like say nuclear development?
Thank you. My name is Abdul Habib bin Abdul Jabbar from Muslim World League. My question is that I noticed that most of the discussion was regarding social protection. Is the idea of approaching the vulnerable population by financing, like microfinance or something, is it something that's considerable here, or it's out of the question? Because these are like kind of full strategies rather than pushing the government or the private sector. And if there is time, someone could say that the issue of encouraging or the private sector to invest, it's always, I think, it leads to the opposite, because when the big investors come with their money, they want the big concessions from the government. So I think this complicates the problem rather than improving the issue about inequality. Thank you.
I didn't quite understand the first question on collecting money from developed countries for.
Like say Marshall Islands, when they developed the nuclear projects before, some 30 years ago, there were a lot of that already done.
Okay, I guess. Well, let me answer it in this way. There are a number of proposals for mobilizing funds. They wouldn't necessarily just be from developed countries, but from more affluent people, like for a financial transactions tax, whose incidence would be mainly more affluent people because they make more financial transactions, and dedicating at least a portion of those funds to development, and could be to social development issues in particular. And I don't know if there's anybody here from the EU, but this is supposed to happen pretty soon for, I believe, 10 countries. And I don't know if how much of that will be for development. And on microfinancing, I give a course sometimes on building inclusive financial sectors for development, which is the title of the book I helped produce. It's curious, that course used to be oversubscribed, and now there are not enough students sign up to even give it. So I guess it was sexy for a while, but it's less so now. But I still think that it's very important to have programs to provide financial services to poor people, and especially savings services and credit. But you have to be very concerned about people becoming over indebted. And one of the reasons people talk about it less now is because of this catastrophe in India, in Andhra Pradesh, where the government let in a lot of private microfinance providers, and people kept borrowing too much and then couldn't pay. This is attributed as one of the reasons for a rash of suicides. obviously, the industry has to be well regulated, so, but it's certainly an important issue. Defer to
Thanks. So on the question of microfinance and general private finance and the big, including the international investors, and one of the changes from Monterey that was in Addis that caused some debate as it was happening was moving the chapter from foreign private investment, which was the chapter in Monterey, where domestic private investment was part of the domestic chapter, to all private investment. That has positives and negatives, but one of the positives I think that came out of it is that the focus on private investment starts on the domestic level. And it starts with domestic investment and a policy framework for domestic private sector. And what's used to be called, what microfinance is a piece of the bigger question of inclusive finance, which there's a large section on that talks about the importance of agreements for financial services for all. It talks about including financial services, including inclusive finance in policy goals, in regulatory goals. It talks about the regulatory system having to cover all types of finance, but it also talks about the importance of looking at a regulatory system not just from the angle of stability, but also what are the impact of that on incentives and lending. So there's a whole very large discussion on a lot of issues and real policy ideas for how to address that. In terms of the bigger question on the other question about firms coming in, big firms, but also domestic firms, it's not just foreign firms, that are in terms of concessions from the government, that are not doing things that are necessarily helpful for sustainable development. I think that the chapter and the negotiators, there was a lot of trying to weigh the importance of private investment with the importance of private investment that is well regulated, that is in the interest, that is aligned with sustainable development, and those issues. So there's a big discussion about that. There are big issues on that as well. And then there's even a discussion, weaker than originally proposed, but on the issue of tax competition, which is this issue of concessions from the government. And it's not, again, it's weak, but one of the things, it's not strong language, but it's there. And one of the things to think about, especially in the follow-up process, is that everything that's there is open for continued discussion. There's continued debate. It's not renegotiating Addis. It's talking about these issues that are in Addis, what's happening with them. And to the extent that they're in the document, there is room and they're on the table for continued discussion. And so those issues are there, and you as civil society, can really help to keep those issues in the limelight, the ones you think are important, that government should continue to discuss. And that's hopefully your role, part of the role as we move things forward and the agenda moves forward.
Thank you. I don't know there's much that I can add to what has been said. Of course, I know the comment about if I might say, the paucity of reference to social protection per se. But I think social protection is, maybe there are some definitional questions. I think throughout this document you will see different dimensions. For example, the empowerment dimension. Sometimes there is the notion of the transfer dimension, unemployment or disability or whatever. But I think that the approach of Addis is sort of a combination of interventions aimed at addressing the challenge of poverty, the challenge of exclusion, financial inclusion, for example, being one of those dimensions. So I agree that we perhaps need a broader approach, if I understand the question from my colleague. The last question, to the whole question of social protection.
Just addressing the question on nuclear damage in the Marshall Islands. So for the Marshall Islands, I think it was 1987 or maybe 89, it's a Compact of Free Association of the United States that gave the Marshall Islands independence, and was also supposed to address past, present, and future nuclear claims. So a special trust fund was set up, and on an annual basis, and also on an ad hoc basis based on different nuclear claims. there's been payouts, and that's supposed to actually, some of the money coming from the Compact of Free Association is supposed to end in 2020. So there's a lot of debate as to how the Marshall Islands should move forward, especially when there continues to be ongoing nuclear claims and different issues associated with the nuclear legacy. But it does exist.
Can I just add one comment on inclusive finance that I think is sort of interesting, is that, the UN system has talked about inclusive finance for quite a long time. I know, Barry, you worked on the whatever color book it was, and the blue book. So, but the interesting thing is that the IMF has now started to work on this issue. And I think it's one of these, and they came out with a paper in September, I think, or in the fall of this year, where they're talking about the issues of inclusive finance and thinking about the importance of not just, like, how does the financial system work in the interest of people? It's not just about, it's about access and who gets credit and how do you, it doesn't mean anything to have a financial system that doesn't lend to people who need the money. So how do you do that in a stable and inclusive way that's also stable and doesn't lead to crises? But the reason I'm bringing this up, and I know we're running out of time, is just because the importance, I think, and maybe I haven't been at the UN long enough to be jaded yet, but it's another example of some of the issues that start out in discussions really here, and that later on start influencing the agenda in DC and elsewhere. And just the importance of continuing to push on so many of these different issues. I mean, sustainability is another one where you talk about the multilateral development banks now thinking about, how do they support climate? These are issues that are brought on the agenda from the discussions in the UN. So it's just a comment that the importance of these, that these have far-reaching impacts than sometimes we remember.
I want to be a little more provocative than Shari was just before on bringing issues to the FFD follow-up forum. That's right. There are quite a few issues which are included in the Addis Agenda as issues needing to be addressed. Well, we have co-sponsoring this side event are the NGO Committee on Financing for Development and the NGO Committee on Social Development. And you people lobby. And, you lobby in New York means you're lobbying missions. And the missions will have to decide what goes on the agenda for the follow-up forum. In what detail, and and how seriously, and how well it will be prepared. And I would think one thing you could put on your agenda is how to make your agenda their agenda. No, make their agenda your agenda. Thank you.
Okay. I think that counts as concluding words. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our speakers. So a round of applause for them.